things around us are subject to changes, be that the societies we are living in or the persons we are living with. In this regard, allow me to give you an example so that this is even clearer to you. The kinds of dresses that were in fashion, that were in trend few years ago have become outdated and old-fashioned by now. In fact, the latest mobile or laptop that you were eyeing few months ago does not continue to be the latest even today. Which means that owing to these technological advancements or different kinds of advancements in the fields of fashion and other things, changes are happening. Similarly, the societies we live in, like many other things, are always subject to changes. That is to say, the societies we are living in today will not remain the same after few years. That said, let us now talk about people who lived hundreds and thousands of years ago. Do you think their lives were also very similar to the lives that we are living today? Most definitely not. From this, many questions stem in our mind. How were the lives of the people who lived hundreds and thousands of years ago? Did they have huge houses and apartments like us to live in? Along with that, what kinds of clothes did they wear? What kinds of foods did they eat? The way you and I have entertainment like sports and movies, did they also have similar kinds of entertainments, if any? These are few of the many questions that are yet to be answered when we begin to talk about people who lived in the prehistoric times. Now, this will be the focus of our discussion. In this lesson, we will be talking about how were the lives of these people, where did these people live, and when, as in around which time did these people live. So let us now embark on this journey and try to find very interesting answers to these questions. Now, when we have to talk about people who lived in prehistoric times, the most important thing that we have to take into account are the sources of history. Now, how do we get to know about people who lived so many thousands of years ago? Most definitely, they did not have social media to record various events in their lives. Now, do you think these people used to write books to keep tracks of the events that used to happen in their lives? This now brings us to a discussion on the sources of history or on the sources of information that we have to gather in this regard. To answer the questions that we now posed, we have to take into account manuscripts, inscriptions, and archaeological findings. Now, these are very crucial when it comes to constructing the history of the past. Now, what are manuscripts, inscriptions, and archaeological findings? This lesson will be devoted to understanding and tracing these various sources of history. So, let us now begin our discussion on these various sources of history. Manuscripts constitute the first source of history that we will be focusing on in this lesson. Now, what are manuscripts? Manuscripts are any kind of records that were written by hand. As you can see here, manuscripts are handwritten records of the past times. Now, how are manuscripts crucial when it comes to understanding the history of the past times? This is because during those days, during the prehistoric times, people did not have access to knowledge like we do today. Which is why whenever any kind of event took place, people used to record these events on something and they used to write these manuscripts by hands. Now, in this regard, think of the textbooks that you read. I'm sure in your class you have many subjects to read, and for all these subjects you have at least a couple of books to study. Now, these are textbooks in which your lessons are printed. Now, suppose this technology of printing had not been invented by now. So, the authors of these books would have written all these lessons by hands in your textbooks. In a similar kind of way, prehistoric people used to write and used to record those events that happened in their lives by hands. Now from this, you must be wondering about the etymology of the word manuscript. As in, from where does this word manuscript come? Let us try to find an answer to this question. The term manuscript owes its origin to the Latin word manu. What does manu mean? Manu means hand. So this justifies that manuscripts are handwritten records of the past. Now what were these manuscripts written on? Now if I ask you to write an essay or an article, you will invariably take out a page from your notebook or start writing on your notebook itself. Now do you think these prehistoric people had papers to write upon? If not, then what did they write upon? These are some of the questions that we will now try to find answers to. Owing to the absence of papers, these manuscripts were written on different kinds of things. Now this was a time when paper was not invented. But does that mean that people will not write? They most definitely wrote manuscripts, and for this they had very different kinds of things. Firstly, they used to write these manuscripts on palm leaves. Now palm leaves manuscripts have been prevalent in the Indian subcontinent since ancient times. Now what happened in those places where palm leaves were not readily available? Does that mean that not getting palm leaves would hinder people from writing manuscripts? Definitely not. For this reason, as in places where manuscripts were not available, people used to write on the barks of a tree that was known as the birch tree. Now the barks of the birch tree were specially prepared to write manuscripts. So here we learned that manuscripts were written either on palm leaves or on the specially prepared barks of the birch tree that grows in the Himalayas. Now from this, another question must be coming to your mind. Whenever we have to write something or speak something, we have to use a language, because without a language, communication can never happen between two persons. Now from seeing these manuscripts, can you identify the languages in which these manuscripts were written? And we should also question the languages that people used to speak back then. Did they speak the languages that you and I speak in today? So let us now find out the languages in which people used to write the manuscripts in those ancient days. Many manuscripts that have been found in the Indian subcontinent were written in Sanskrit. And from this we inferred that Sanskrit was the language that was used by learned men and scholars who mostly wrote these manuscripts. Along with that, manuscripts that are also written in Tamil could be found in the southern parts of the Indian subcontinent. From this, we understand that the language Tamil that we use even today was in use so many hundreds and thousands of years ago as well. Now we have learned that Sanskrit and Tamil were languages that were mostly used by the scholars and the learned men. But does that mean that ordinary people did not write their manuscripts? In the Indian subcontinent, many manuscripts have also been found that were written in Prakrit. And from this, we infer that Prakrit was a language that was used by the ordinary people. So, we learnt that these manuscripts were written either on palm leaves or the specially prepared barks of the birch trees. We also learned that these manuscripts were mostly written in Sanskrit, Tamil and Prakrit as well. Now, whenever you open a textbook or any other kind of book, you know what to expect from the book. That book will either teach you some lessons, or in that book you will find interesting stories and poems. But what were written on these manuscripts? As in, what kind of subjects did these manuscripts deal with? These manuscripts dealt with a host of subjects in the likes of religious beliefs, practices, lives of kings, medicines, sciences, epics, poems, and on goes the list. Now we have to understand that this was a time when paper and printing technology had not come into being. So in the absence of paper, religious beliefs and practices were recorded on these manuscripts, and it is from these manuscripts that we get to know about the religions that were practiced by the people who lived in the ancient periods. From this we also get information on the lives of kings. From this we also know about the medicines and the sciences that had developed then. Along with this, literary things like epics, poems and plays were also written on manuscripts, because as we just mentioned, there was no other book or paper to be written upon. The beginning of this lesson introduced us to manuscripts that were written on palm leaves or barks of trees. From this we can understand that these materials were fragile and perishable. Now what do you do to keep the pages of your books from falling apart? You either use sellotapes or you get those books bound by hardcovers, and then you keep these books safely upright in your bookshelves. But these manuscripts were not as hard and firmly binded like the books we use today, which is why these manuscripts were very fragile. And over time, many of these manuscripts got destroyed. These manuscripts got perished or eaten away by insects. Because if you try to keep with you a leaf for a long period of time, you will see that over time that leaf will start withering. That leaf will not remain as fresh as it initially was. And when something is written on that leaf, it invariably means that that leaf, along with whatever is written on it, will start perishing. And this is something that happened with the manuscripts as well. So very unfortunately, many of these manuscripts that contained very important and crucial information about the lives of people in these ancient times have not survived over time. But some manuscripts have survived the ravages of time, be that in a partial way or completely. And where are these manuscripts kept? These manuscripts are now safely preserved in museums. So many manuscripts were destroyed or perished by the taints of time, and some of these surviving manuscripts could now be found in museums. Written records constitute a very important source of history, because without written records, we have no access to the lives of the people who lived hundreds and thousands of years ago. But this discussion had us understand that manuscripts are fragile and perishable. Now, when we have to trace the history of the past times, we rely upon another kind of written records. What are these written records known as? These are known as inscriptions. Now, what were these inscriptions? In these inscriptions, writings were made on relatively hard surfaces such as stone or metal. Now, you must be wondering how these inscriptions were made. On these hard surfaces of stone and metal, engravings were made. Writings were inscribed on these hard surfaces, and these hard surfaces with the inscribed writings on them came to be known as inscriptions. While on the one hand, we have manuscripts that were very easily perishable, that are very fragile. Inscriptions, on the other hand, constitute a more reliable source of information when we begin to reconstructing the history of the past. These inscriptions offer us a host of information on the past times that have survived over the centuries. So let us now find out a little more about these inscriptions and how these inscriptions were made. Since inscriptions constitute written records, what we have to take into account are the subjects of these inscriptions. Now, what were written on these inscriptions? On these inscriptions, different kinds of events that happened in the past, the rules of various kings and rulers, various historical events were recorded. Along with this, many kings often got their orders inscribed on stone pillars and walls. Now, what was the purpose behind this? This was done in order to make the rule or the orders of those kings available to common people. So from these inscriptions, the common people were made aware of the various orders and diktats of the kings. Here you can see a pictorial depiction of an inscription that could be found on a temple wall in Hampi. Now, inscriptions that were made on monuments, temples and different kinds of architectural pieces tell us about the time in which those inscriptions were made. This also tells us about the reasons why these inscriptions were made and the names of the rulers in most cases who ordered these inscriptions. Now, in this regard, let us now focus on one inscription in detail. The inscription that we are talking about in this regard is the Kandahar inscription. The Kandahar inscription is around 2250 years old. Can you imagine how old this must be? And along with this, you should also wonder at the fact that something that was made so many thousands of years ago has still survived even today. Now, when was this Kandahar inscription made, to be very specific? This inscription was made in 260 BC. And where can this inscription be found? This inscription is found in a place called Kandahar that is situated in the modern day country of Afghanistan. Now, while we talked about the fact that many kings ordered these inscriptions, many kings commissioned these inscriptions, you must be wondering which king ordered the Kandahar inscription. Let us try to find this out. To answer this question, the Kandahar inscription was inscribed as per the orders of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. Ashoka ruled from around 268 BCE to 232 BCE. And Ashoka was the third great emperor of the Mauryan Empire. Mauryan Empire was founded by Chandragupta Maurya and he was succeeded by Bindusara, following which Ashoka was the emperor of the Mauryan Empire and it was Ashoka who ordered the Kandahar inscription. Before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. Which ruler commissioned the Kandahar inscription? Was it Ashoka, Chandragupta Maurya, Bimbisara or Vikramaditya? Well, the correct answer is Ashoka. It was Ashoka, in accordance with whose order the Kandahar inscription was inscribed. Now, allow me to tell you a very interesting fact about this Kandahar inscription. This Kandahar inscription is bilingual in nature. Now, what does this word bilingual mean? This word bilingual means that two languages were used simultaneously in this inscription. Now, which are the two languages that we can find in the Kandahar inscription? The top of this inscription was inscribed in Greek and the bottom part was inscribed in Aramaic. From this, we can also infer that Greek and Aramaic were the two languages that were in use by the people who lived in Kandahar around this time. we have learnt about that these inscriptions were mostly made by the kings who wanted to celebrate their rule, who wanted to keep themselves immortal in the pages of history, so to speak. But other kinds of inscriptions were also made by men and women, which mostly included the kings and the queens. Now, what did they record in those inscriptions? They recorded accounts of their lives. Along with this, there were many kings who recorded their victories in battles on those inscriptions. For this, you have to keep in mind that there was an absence of paper, printing technology and all the things that we have today. Because whenever any eventful period happens today, or whenever there is any significant event, we try to record that in our diaries or in our books. But these kinds of things did not exist in those ancient times, which is why the rulers or even the common people who lived back then had to rely upon inscriptions. So these are the two very important and crucial literary sources, as in the manuscripts and inscriptions that contain very valuable information on the past times. As a quick recap, let us briefly touch upon the sources of history that we have already learned. We have talked about manuscripts and inscriptions, which were written records of the past times. Now, do you think it is very easy to understand what were written in those manuscripts and inscriptions? This is because these inscriptions were mostly written in scripts that we do not understand today. Now, if I give you an inscription, will you be able to decipher what is written in it? I don't think you will be able to do so, because you don't know the languages that people thousands of years ago used to write in. In fact, many of these manuscripts also survive only partially, and other halves of those manuscripts have perished over time. Now, will it be possible for you if I give you only the half of a page to understand what was written in it? It will not be possible for you to do so. Now, who does this work for us? As in, who helps us in constructing and reconstructing the history of the past? For this, there are academically and scientifically trained professionals who are known as archaeologists. Without the help of the archaeologists, in this regard, we will never be able to understand how the lives of the people have been so many thousands of years ago. So, this new source of history, as in archaeological findings, is something that we will now focus upon. Archaeology constitutes that branch of studies that talks about or that discusses what happened in the past times. Now, how does archaeology understand what happened so many thousands of years ago? For this, the material cultures constitute a very important thing to them. What are material cultures? Material cultures are the different kinds of things that people used at one point of time. And these things today survive as artifacts. These artifacts may include the things, the utensils, the ornaments, and different kinds of things that people used to use back then. Along with that, archaeology also takes into account where these people lived. All these together constitute the material culture that is a very crucial source of information to this branch of study known as archaeology. And it is with the help of archaeology that we get to understand our past. Now, an archaeologist is a person who studies the past through the material remains. What do these archaeologists do? They excavate different sites, and these excavations happen either deliberately or often accidentally. Doesn't this sound very fascinating to you? Because accidentally as well, many excavations have taken place with which we got to know about different civilizations that existed in the past. Now, an archaeologist is that trained professional who studies human history from the prehistoric times, from the times when stone tools were used for the first time to a few decades ago. So this is the vast time period that archaeologists take into account. And through this process of archaeological findings, they find the remains of the past. The remains of the past may include buildings, sculptures, tools, and various other objects that were used by people who lived so many hundreds and thousands of years ago. Now, why do these archaeologists have to do proper excavations? This is because the civilizations that existed in the past have become buried underground. These civilizations in most cases do not exist or do not happen on the ground today. Since these places are buried underground, since these different kinds of artifacts are also buried underground, archaeologists have to perform excavations, and through these archaeological excavations, through these archaeological findings, we get to know so much about our past, about the people who lived in the past times. Now let us focus on the work of the archaeologists in slightly greater detail. Archaeologists explore and excavate to find different kinds of things like tools, weapons, pots, pans, ornaments, coins, bones of animals, and other things. Now, how do these things, how do the finding of these things help us in understanding the history of the past? This is because when we find the tools that were used by people in the ancient times, we can understand the metals that were used by the people to make these tools. From the weapons and the pots, pans, we can understand the metals used by them and simultaneously the utensils that they used to make for the preparation of food, for the storing of food. The weapons also tell us about their hunting techniques. So from these weapons we get to know how these people used to hunt animals, how these people used to defend themselves from attacks. Along with that, ornaments tell us about the kind of jewelry that was worn by people so many thousands of years ago. In this regard, coins constitute a very crucial source of information, because on these coins we can find the dates or the time period in which these coins were minted. Many of these coins also contain the images of the rulers. So from this we can understand the names of the rulers who ruled and the time period when they ruled. Along with this, the bones of animals also constitute a very important source of information when we come to understand the ways of lives of people in the ancient times. How is it so? Because from the bones of animals that have been excavated, we can understand that these animals used to live back then. And from this, we can also understand that many of these animals have become extinct over time. Many of these animals still continue to exist even today. From the bones of these animals, we also understand the eating habits or the food that was consumed by the people living back then. So you can understand how important archaeological findings are when we have to talk about our past, when we have to trace and retrace our steps back to the origins of time. So we can understand how important archaeological findings are when we have to retrace our steps back to the past times. This brings us to an end of our discussion on the sources of history. Here we got to learn about two kinds of sources of history. One constitutes the written records. And in these written records, we focused on manuscripts and inscriptions in great detail. Manuscripts were handwritten records, and these manuscripts were written on palm leaves or the specially prepared barks of birch trees. From there we went on to understanding about inscriptions which were made on hard surfaces like copper plates, metal, stones and clay walls. Now from this we then went on to understanding about archaeological findings and how important archaeological findings are when it comes to understanding the history of our past. In a subsequent lesson we will talk about how the concept of dating came into being. And from that, we will also discuss some of the very ancient civilizations that came into being on the face of Earth. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million+ questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.